in the late 60s in Paris, there was a group called the Situationists. And one of the things that they talked about is that what we need to do is to, when we come upon a situation of oppression, is that we need to create new situations.
Right.
Right? We need to create new possibilities that we had envisioned before. So in the case of Miss Ward, it said, well, the marshals are coming, what are we going to do? It's the end of the line. We throw. No, you don't throw up your arm. You imagine new possibilities. Yeah, we bring a lot of people here. We face this guy down, and we're going to keep her in her house. We don't care that the courts and the banks and all these people have their own discourse, which is a big fraud.
Right.
We don't take that seriously.
Right.
We take it seriously to the extent that we oppose it. But once we get to that point, we realize that we have the power on the streets, but we have to occupy our brain in a new way. We have to envision new possibilities, new situations, in order for people to get that kind of inspiration. So, you know, that's a real big part of it, because there's a lot of fatalism, there's a lot of very short-sightedness out there on the part of even movement people who have lost faith. They don't have a vision. They don't have the you know, I don't want to say it's a cowardice thing or guts or anything like that.
They don't believe.
But they don't believe, right? And so what people saw with this war is that yes, we could change this one situation. We could, you know, when it didn't seem there was any possibilities, there was a possibility to keep her in her house.
Well, the other great situationist slogan was "Sur le pavé la Prague," where beneath the streets, there's a beach.
Exactly.
So we see right after Miss Ward, you see the occupation of Zuccotti Park and people reimagining public space and reimagining different kinds of social uses, social relations that can come out of that space. And I saw it as a continuation of gardening and squatting and critical mass. I mean, how do you see those things fitting together through these years?
Well, I think that there's always been a movement, and it goes through various stages. And I think that what we've seen with the Occupy movement of late is just a reemergence, I think really in a much more broad way of an alternative, countercultural, counter-establishment, as we used to say, movement. Yeah, and it may not have a unified line or a unified perspective on how we're going to make revolution in America and so forth and so on, but nonetheless, it's a movement that's reemerged. And to me, it's just it's you know, it's due. It's due, and it will reflect the same kinds of tendencies that movements have always had. I mean, there are people who are going to be wanting to do the kinds of direct action that squatting is about, and other kinds of grassroots appropriation of the means for sustaining our lives together in communities, seizing spaces for community centers, alternatives in terms of food and housing and so forth. But I think that the challenge now, because it's not like the system or the establishment or the enemy has remained in place. There's been an evolution or de-evolution of sorts in the nature of evil. And I think the situation now is actually much more ominous and dangerous than it was back in the 60s. So I think now it requires an even sharper political analysis and analysis of how we are really going to affect power. That it's not enough to create counter power or counter institutions or alternative institutions that run in parallel. That's required, and that's what people do naturally. People will do that. They're going to do that. But we're going to have to eventually deconstruct this machine, this monster, and we're going to have to figure out a way to amass the kind of power that will allow us to do that. Now, maybe it's really going to be a question of non-cooperation. You know, the classical Thoreau and other ways of looking at it, general strikes and this approach. But in any case, I'm optimistic, because the scene now, I think, is much smarter than it's been. I remember talking to Tom Hayden during the RNC when he was here in New York, 2004, and he was saying, yeah, this movement's a lot bigger and smarter than our scene was in the 60s, and it's true. It's true. You know, we would go to a demo and, you know, bring the troops home from Vietnam and so on, but that was the extent of our analysis, really. We were all living in the Aquarian age, was ready to bloom. How you doing? And then, you know, I think that there's a lot more sophisticated ways of looking at the world, and kind of the neoliberal enemy, and just the nature of global economy and so on and so forth that really gives me hope. But that remains to be seen to what extent we can really galvanize that kind of intellectual strength alongside of the grassroots appropriation of land and space and so forth, which has to happen.
Yeah. Well, the contested space, I mean, finally, as we think about it, as you think about the expression, the creativity that you talked about with Seth and with the artists and and then the police repression. Where do you see this dialectic shaping? Because I see this being New York as being like the Mondrian painting, the Broadway Boogie Woogie, where there's this creativity that comes out of these crashing between forces.
Right.
And I feel like every time I ride my bike, I see these forces coming together. When I look at these trees and I think about what these trees might have seen or heard, and I think there's something very powerful about being in New York and looking at how we continue to build spaces despite these pressures.
Yeah, I think we are going to have to be a lot more creative about the, within the context of zigging and zagging and to and froing with the police. I think the stakes are high, and I think, for instance, the level of brutality that's been unleashed against the Occupy movement around the country. I think there's an agenda here, and that's to intimidate and to criminalize, and the whole domestic terrorism thing.
Posse comitatus. I mean, you talk about that being eroded. What is that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the recent passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, which allows for the detention of citizens, non-citizens that was already there, but to be detained without the writ of habeas corpus and so without charge. I mean, it's tantamount. It's the idea of the increasing symbiosis and identity of the police and military function is the definition of a police state. And what we have in this country right now is precisely that. The ongoing evisceration of the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a federal statute that limits the ability of the military to engage in domestic law enforcement, has all been undone.
Right.
So we are at a situation now where the movement really needs to think very clearly about where we want to spend our time and how we want to spend our time.
Right.
There are avenues of approach.
Yeah.
But it may be that we need to engage in a long process of education to move out into communities around the country who maybe are being manipulated and led down the wrong path, and engage in a lot of political education. Spend less time trying to beat up against the barricades, and more time fanning out into the neighborhoods.
Go local.
Because and even in terms of that, though, there's still a whole lot of direct action in terms of occupation of vacant spaces, urban gardens, and so forth, which can be happening as well. I mean, that's always a good thing to do. That's ongoing.
Yeah.
But in terms of a real kind of political strategy, in terms of how we are going to deal with this elite in this country, this fascist-oriented elite that seems to be dead set on its agenda of global domination through the Pentagon Incorporated.
Profits over people.
And austerity at home and abroad and domestically. That's their agenda.
Yeah.
So we have to be really smart about how we go about, framing a strategy for the future, for real revolutionary change in this country, which by implication is revolution throughout the world.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, the U.S. has got its tentacles, its corporate tentacles throughout the world, and what happens here will have effects all throughout the world.
I've asked you so many questions. We've been talking. Do we miss anything, or do we feel like we've covered some of what we need? Do you feel like you've?
I think we've covered pretty much.
I mean,
sweetheart.
Frank, I can't thank you enough. You're my hero. Thank you.
Yeah.